He told police he was fishing alone on Christmas Eve in the San Francisco Bay. Quiet morning, still water, nothing unusual. But weeks later, everything changed. His wife's body surfaced, less than a mile from where he said he had been fishing, and nearby, the remains of their unborn son were found. More than 2 decades later, this case is back in court. Not because of a confession, not because of DNA, but because a team of lawyers is now arguing that the man convicted of this crime might be innocent, and just as strongly, a retired homicide detective is saying they're completely wrong. Tonight, this is the story. Not rumors, not speculation, just what's real, what's disputed, and what still doesn't sit right. Backhand index pointing right before we go any further. If you want real, fact-based true crime without the noise, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Cases like this don't end when the verdict is read, and you don't want to miss what happens next. It began with a disappearance. Laci Peterson was 8 months pregnant when she vanished from her home in Modesto, California. It was Christmas Eve, the kind of day that should have been ordinary. Last-minute errands, quiet anticipation, a family preparing to welcome a child. But by the evening, something was wrong. She wasn't answering her phone. She hadn't returned home, and the unease grew quickly into alarm. Her husband, Scott Peterson, told police he had spent the day fishing, alone, in the San Francisco Bay. First, it sounded routine, but almost immediately, investigators began to question the timeline. Because while Laci was missing, Scott's behavior didn't follow the pattern they expected to see. There was no visible panic, no urgent search, no desperation in the early hours. And in cases like this, those details matter. The search intensified. Friends, family, volunteers, they all came together. Flyers were posted. Neighborhoods were combed. Hope held on, but only barely, because with each passing day, the possibility of finding Laci alive began to slip away. Then came the discovery. Months later, along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay, remains were found. First, the body of an infant, then the body of a woman. The location mattered, because it was close, uncomfortably close, to where Scott said he had been fishing. The day Laci disappeared, that moment changed everything. The case was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was now a homicide, and Scott Peterson became the focus. What followed was not a single piece of evidence, but a chain of circumstances. Prosecutors built their case on what's known as circumstantial evidence. Not one defining moment, but many smaller ones, each pointing in the same direction. They argued that Scott had a motive, that he was living a double life, that he had told another woman he was a widower even before Laci disappeared. They pointed to inconsistencies, behavior that didn't align with a grieving husband. They highlighted the location of the bodies, the timing, the patterns. Individually, each detail might not have been enough, but together, they formed a narrative. The defense pushed back. They argued there was no direct evidence, no eyewitness, no confession, no definitive forensic link. They suggested investigators had focused too quickly on Scott and ignored other possibilities. That once suspicion took hold, everything else was filtered through it. The trial captured national attention. Every detail was analyzed, every movement scrutinized, and in the end, the jury reached a verdict. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of his wife and second-degree murder in the death of their unborn son. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. For many, that was the end of the story, but not for everyone, because some believed, and still believe, that questions were left unanswered. Years later, those questions resurfaced. In 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project took on the case. That alone was enough to bring attention back. These organizations exist to re-examine convictions, to look for mistakes, oversights, or evidence that didn't get a fair hearing. And after reviewing the case, they decided to act. They filed a habeas corpus petition, a legal challenge to the validity of Scott Peterson's conviction. But this wasn't one argument. It was 14 separate claims, 14 different ways of saying, this case deserves another look. At the center of those claims were a few key ideas. A burglary near the Peterson home that may not have been fully explored. Witnesses who believed they saw a pregnant woman after the time prosecutors said Laci had died. A burned-out van that some argued could hold overlooked evidence. And new interpretations of ocean currents and tidal movement, suggesting the bodies may not have traveled the way the prosecution claimed. On the surface, it sounded compelling. Pieces that didn't quite fit, details that raised doubt. But in court, possibility isn't enough. Each claim was reviewed, examined, weighed, and in April of 2026, a judge issued a decision. All 14 claims denied. Some, the court said, should have been raised earlier. Others simply didn't meet the legal standard required to reopen the case. The conclusion was clear. There wasn't enough to overturn the conviction. For some, that reaffirmed the original verdict. For others, it raised new frustration because the questions, at least in their minds, still remained. The legal fight didn't end there. The Innocence Project filed an appeal. Now the case moves into a different phase. Not a retrial, not a re-examination of guilt or innocence, but a review of the process itself. Did the court apply the law correctly? That's the question now. Backhand index pointing right if you're still watching at this point. Drop a comment that says, I'm still here. Let's see who's truly following this case all the way through. At the same time, public attention returned. A documentary, Scott Peterson, The New Evidence, brought the case back into the spotlight, presented the alternative theories, the overlooked details, the unanswered questions, and for many viewers, it shifted perspective. But not everyone agreed. A retired homicide detective, someone who worked the original investigation, spoke out. His argument was direct. The documentary focused on fragments, without showing the full picture. Because the jury, he said, didn't decide based on one detail. They saw everything together. And that's where the case stands today. Two competing views. One side sees reasonable doubt. The other sees a verdict, supported by the totality of evidence. Right now, Scott Peterson remains in prison. His conviction stands. The appeal is ongoing, and the final word has not yet been spoken, because in the end, this case isn't being decided in documentaries or in comment sections. It's being decided in court, quietly, carefully, one legal question at a time. And until that process is complete, the story isn't over. Backhand index pointing right, so now I want to hear from you. Do you think this case deserves another look? Or do you believe justice has already been served? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more true crime stories told with clarity and facts, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next.